All right, let's continue our discussion here of how we interact with these microbes. So, as it says, our resident microbes colonize us for the long term and do not necessarily cause disease as long as we are healthy, as long as we don't give them access to areas they shouldn't be in. Our resident microbiota does not cause us any problems. Like we said, for the most part, we believe this is a type of mutualistic association where um, both us and the microbes are benefiting from the situation. Okay. Now, when we talk about infection and disease, they may sound pretty similar to each other, the terms infection or disease, but they do mean different things. So we can have an infection, but that does not necessarily mean that it will cause a disease. So we say that an infection is when microbes get past our host defenses, they enter our tissues, and they start to multiply. So that is an infection. So an infection does not necessarily cause disease. So for instance, HIV is an infection with the virus, but the disease would be AIDS. So you can be HIV positive, but it doesn't mean that you have AIDS. So a disease then is a deviation from health. As it says, damage or disruption of tissues or organs is a disease. So then we have infectious disease as our next term, because a disease is not always an infectious disease. We can talk about cardiovascular disease. That's not necessarily an infectious disease. So infectious disease is kind of putting the two of them together, where we've got a state that is caused by microorganisms or their products, and we've got damage or disruption occurring to the tissues and the organs from kind of this overgrowth of microorganisms that aren't supposed to be there. Now we can apply some terms to these microorganisms, and we can describe some of them as being a pathogen. So as it says, a microbe whose relationship with its host is parasitic. So that's one of those partnerships that we talked about where the host does not gain anything and is actually harmed by the relationship, and the parasite obviously is the one who is benefiting. So we consider these microbes to be pathogens when they are parasitic. And that leads us to the term of pathogenicity. So this refers to, as it says, an organism's potential to cause disease. So pathogenicity is basically an all or nothing term, right? So it can either cause disease or it doesn't cause disease, right? So when we look at different microbes, we can look at them as, are they going to be able to cause disease or do they not cause disease? So pathogenicity, then we can drill down to talking about true pathogens versus opportunistic pathogens. And I want to go to opportunistic pathogens first. So these are ones that can cause disease when they're given a certain situation. And so a lot of times these are kind of pathogens that are just kind of lying in wait, waiting for the perfect opportunity to get a foothold in your body. So as it says, they can cause disease when your defenses are compromised, or they become established in a part of the body that's not natural to them. So a lot of times these are your resident biota that are there. And once again, if they're on the outside of your skin and you get a cut, and now some of that bacteria gets into that cut, that's an opportunity for that pathogen. So now they're introduced into a part of the body where they weren't before. It's not part of where they normally reside, and this can cause an infectious disease. So I have down here Candida albicans as an example. We talked about Candida albicans as being able to cause yeast infections in women, vaginal yeast infections. So remember, Candida is always present and it's pretty much kept in check when you're healthy. But let's say if you're taking antibiotics to kill off a different bacteria, and once again, it upsets your microbiome, now there's an opportunity for the Candida to start growing and to get out of hand. So that's an opportunistic pathogen. So when your host defenses are down, maybe your natural microbiome is kind of preoccupied in fighting off other things, then these pathogens can get a foothold. A true pathogen, on the other hand, is one that can cause disease in a healthy person. So it doesn't necessarily need an opportunity. It just needs to be able to make contact with you. So colds and flus a lot of time are true pathogens because even though you're healthy, these things affect pretty much everybody. Now, factors that can weaken your host defenses, right? A lot of these are pretty intuitive. Age obviously has an effect. If you have any weakened immune system, whether that's because of your genetics or acquired defects in your immune system. So some individuals have severe combined immunodeficiency disorders. Obviously, they're going to be a lot more susceptible to these pathogens. Any type of underlying disease, the drugs that you're taking, we've already kind of talked about that, how they can make you more open to infectious diseases. And obviously, if you're on chemotherapy or anything that's suppressing your normal immune response, that can definitely allow more pathogens to get a foothold. And physical and mental stress, right? Pregnancy and stress. Stress again, in case we didn't mention it. There's growing bodies of evidence that shows that when you are under chronic stress, that your body kind of initiates an inflammation response. And that long-term inflammation can also lead to cardiovascular disease. So they're looking at all these connections and how stress affects your body. So being stressed all the time can potentially make you more open to some of these pathogens. Now we talked about pathogenicity as kind of being an all or nothing. It can be a pathogen or not a pathogen versus virulence. So virulence is kind of like another adjective to describe these infectious diseases. Now, in this case, it's we can describe virulence as being a mild or maybe being more severe. So it kind of describes the severity of the disease, how virulent it is, all right, how virulent that pathogen is. And these kind of, they relate back to the virulence factors. So as it says, any characteristic or structure that contributes to its ability to establish itself in the host or to cause damage, or I should say, and to cause damage. Okay, so these are what we call virulence factors. These are the ways that the pathogens kind of overcome our defenses. And so these include features that the microbes have that allow them to adhere to the host cell. How well can they adhere to that host cell? Because they have to be able to make contact with that host cell. How well can they invade your tissue? How well can they get to nutrients? How well can they get away from your immune system or trick your immune system? These are all virulence factor. Sometimes they can include toxins. any substance to kind of thwart your immune system, or anything that's used to damage your cells. So it can also include how easily they are transmitted from one individual to another. These are all considered virulence factors. And we'll talk more about some of these virulence factors. All right. But right now, let's throw out another term, microbial synergism. All right, kind of working together again. So here we have polymicrobial infection. So since we've been talking about infectious disease, true infections, opportunistic infections, but we may also want to consider polymicrobial infections. And so these may be much more prevalent than we ever think about, because most infections probably are polymicrobial, but you typically only spot one of the pathogens by the disease, or excuse me, by the test that you're using. So if you go to the doctor and they're going to do a test, and that test is mainly meant to pick up just one microorganism. It's not meant to test for multiple microorganisms. So it could be that you got multiple microbes that have infected you, but only one's going to be picked up upon. So we've got the example here of the flu infection frequently leads to pneumonia. So influenza or flu are viruses, and they can lead to bacterial pneumonia. So even though you've got a viral infection, it can make you more susceptible to a secondary infection, which could be a bacterial pneumonia. And so we see this frequently, that flu will lead to pneumonia. And so this would be an example of polymicrobial infections.